Today we're here to talk about flexible syndromic testing, particularly within the context of gastrointestinal testing. And our main speaker here today is Dr. Pride. So with Dr. Pride being local in San Diego, I'm sure a lot of you already know who he is. But for those unfamiliar, Dr. Pride is the director of microbiology and the director of the PALMS lab with UC Health San Diego. So I'm going to set the stage for Dr. Pride. When we talk about this flexible concept, it's kind of complicated to speak to the logistics of it. So I'm going to try to set the stage for Dr. Pride, try to explain what we mean by flexible syndromic testing, and then turn it over to him so he can provide his experience with molecular GI testing and his perspective on this flexible approach. But what I want to start with is the why. So why flexible testing with these different disease states where you're commonly seeing these syndromic options out there? The big part of it is the financial strains on the healthcare system, right? Our healthcare costs are always going up. The reimbursement landscape, typically reimbursement is either staying flat or in a lot of cases there's downward pressure on reimbursement. In the context of these syndromic panels, a lot of times payers are not willing to pay for these big syndromic panels unless the patient meets a very specific criteria, like if they're immune compromised. So this flexibility allows you to navigate this complicated financial landscape. So there is this kind of increased focus on diagnostic stewardship, trying to constrain our testing to what's most appropriate for that patient and avoid over-testing or testing for things that maybe aren't clinically relevant for that patient. And you're trying to do this in the context of an evolving staffing landscape for the lab, right? Especially post-COVID. So you're being asked to do more with less. So one of the nice things about these syndromic panels is you're running a bunch of tests, a bunch of different targets at once on one sample with one easy workflow. So how can we maintain that kind of easy workflow that syndromic testing can provide while also providing you these options and flexibility within this testing landscape? So our new approach to this is on our LIAISON PLEX platform. So for those not familiar, LIAISON PLEX launched in 2024 with our respiratory panel. We also have some blood culture assays available on this, and then we are hoping to have our GI panel at some point in the first half of next year. And if you're not not familiar with Diasorin's history in the syndromic testing space, Diasorin acquired Luminex back in 2021. And then Luminex acquired a company called Nanosphere back in 2017. And Nanosphere launched that original Veregene platform. So that was kind of our original entry into this automated syndromic testing space. And with that Veregene platform, we always had this philosophy around providing our customers a little bit more control over their testing needs. So with our blood culture assays, we've always had a split panel design where you can use your gram stain to decide which panel you need to run and try to conserve costs that way. With our enteric pathogens panel on the Veregene, that was always a purposefully constrained panel. It was a 9-target panel, kind of more geared towards that community-acquired diarrhea or acute diarrhea space. And then we also did have a respiratory panel on the Veregene that had that flexible concept. I would consider that more semi-customizable because we took that respiratory panel and we divided it up into 5 different groups. And then depending on how many of those 5 groups you ran, dictated the price of the test. With LIAISON PLEX, we wanted to take that flexible testing approach to the next level. So this is truly fully customizable syndromic testing. You can literally take any panel or any target on the panel and decide which ones that you want to run. And then the price that you pay for that test just revolves around the total number of targets chosen. So it's really kind of providing that financial control, that diagnostic stewardship landscape. And then we really focused on increasing that operational efficiency of that Veregene platform and trying to create one of the easiest workflows on the market with this new system. So I know this is a GI talk and this is a respiratory panel slide. To speak to how flex testing works, I'm going to do that within the context of respiratory because this is available on market today, so I can provide a little bit more detail as to how it works with respiratory, just the logistics of it. And then we will pivot back over to GI, I promise. So as you can see with this respiratory panel, we have 19 targets, 5 bacterial targets, and 14 viral targets. And when our customers run this test at the contracting phase, they have essentially 2 different options. They can go with fixed testing or fixed pricing, or they can go with flexible pricing or flex testing. So fixed testing, this is what you're used to with syndromic testing. This is where you're paying the same price and you're getting access to all of the targets on the panel. So the customers that gravitate towards this, maybe they're primarily testing inpatients where they're not having to navigate that reimbursement landscape, and they're just trying to kind of cast that broad net to figure out what's going on with those patients. Maybe they're just trying to keep things simple, right? Their clinicians have become used to these big respiratory panels, and that's what they expect to see. And then if you were to implement some sort of flexible approach, that's something new that requires education. It's a little bit more complex of an implementation. So if they want to keep things simple, sometimes they'll gravitate towards this fixed testing option. So you do have this option with all of our panels. But you do also have a flex testing option. So this goes back to what I was talking about, where you can take whatever targets you see on that panel and you can design your own custom panels from that. And again, your cost will revolve around the number of targets chosen. So again, this is more geared towards those customers that do want to take more control over their costs. Maybe they do have a bigger outpatient population where they're trying to navigate that reimbursement landscape. And this gives them a little bit more control over that. So now we're going to get into how that flex testing works. So I'm sure the concept makes sense in your head, but then how do we actually, operationally execute this with our customers? So if you are a flex testing customer, you're going to be purchasing 2 products from us. One is the test cartridge itself. So that's no different from any other diagnostic test out there. The other part number that you'll be purchasing is what we call flex credits. So all flex credits it's a barcode that you'll get. You'll scan the barcode onto the platform, and then these flex credits go into the system. And these flex credits get used as needed depending on the number of targets chosen for that panel. So we have what's called the base price. So you can see with respiratory, that base price includes anywhere between 1 to 7 targets. So that's what you get when you purchase that test cartridge from us. Right? So it doesn't matter if you're running 1 target or 7 targets, you are covered with the cost of the test in that base price. If you were to go beyond 1 to 7 targets, that next tier of targets would be 8 to 13 targets. So again, whether you're running 8 targets or 13 targets, you are in that next tier, and that is going to take 5 flex credits from the system. So again, these flex credits, it's just a separate part number that you're purchasing, loading these credits onto the system, and it will automatically deduct those credits as needed, depending on how many targets are ran on that particular test. So the next tier would be 14 to 19 targets. Same thing. If you're running 14 targets or 19 targets, you are in that final tier, and that would take an additional 5 flex credits from the system. So now you're at 10 total flex credits if you're to run kind of this last tier of testing. So as long as you're in this base price or this middle tier here, you're going to save money compared to if you were running the full panel every single time. So again, the customers that gravitate towards this testing method are those that know they're not going to be running the full panel on the majority of their patients. So again, how does this work logistically? Again, all the customer needs to do is they place an order for that flex credits part number. We will process that order and we will deliver those credits with a barcode. So the vast majority of our customers will get that delivered via email. But if for whatever reason you have constraints on to whether or not you can receive these emails, we can also physically mail a barcode that can be scanned onto the platform. So we have that barcode scanner it's the same barcode scanner that you would use to scan the test cartridge, and the sample barcode would be used to scan that barcode for the flex credits. So when customers consider implementing this, it sounds good, but then when they get to the implementation component of it, it starts to sound a little bit more complex. So we've seen two different approaches out there for this. The first approach on the left is just customizing and saving smaller panels into the system. You offer those as orderables for your clinicians, and when they order those tests, you run it, and whatever those results are, positive or negative, you're done after that, right? There's no reflexing, there's no going out to additional targets. It's just, you're doing the same thing you're doing with a big syndromic panel, you're just doing a more constrained panel, more appropriate for your patient needs and your institution's needs. The other approach that we've seen out there is algorithms, right? You start with a small panel, and then if those targets are negative on that small panel, you'd reflex out to additional targets. And we are able to do this on that platform with an instant reflex. And this is enabled by what we call this digital sample technology. So when you run the test, this is a microarray, and all these different squares that you see on here are meant to represent that microarray. The chemistry runs all the targets on that microarray, but it only analyzes the targets that were selected. So a big question for us, or kind of the ethical dilemma that sometimes comes up, is, will I know if any of these targets that I don't run are positive in the background? And the answer is no, right? Because we are only analyzing the targets that you selected. Everything else is being saved as a digital sample, but it's not being analyzed by the platform. So not only does the lab not know if any of these additional targets are positive or negative in the background, our system or our platform also does not know, because that analysis step has not taken place yet. So in this example, they've chosen 5 targets to start with. On the right, you see all the red over there. That's meant to represent that all 5 of those targets are negative. So if they did want to reflex out to additional targets, they could choose whatever targets they want to reflex to at that point. And then it is not until they actually choose that in the software where the instrument will analyze those targets and determine if they're positive or negative. Okay, so in this particular example, they chose 5 more targets, and then now they've found they're positive, and they're done from there. So again, that sample is saved in the software as a digital sample. If you've ran it, you just go back into the software, find it, open up whatever additional targets you need, but there's no need to rerun a test or wait for that 2-hour turnaround time with the initial test. So this is the GI panel that we have in development, and we're hoping to get submitted to the FDA soon. You can see it's a very comprehensive panel with bacterial targets, 5 viral targets, and if we can get all of these cleared through the FDA, one of the most comprehensive parasite options on the market with 8 parasite targets. But GI is really, in our minds, where this flex testing concept has always made the most sense. There's really clear clinical guidelines out there for when you should be testing for targets like this. If you look at the IDSA clinical guidelines for infectious diarrhea, they would say only run a big panel like this if the patient's immune compromised, or maybe you're dealing with an outbreak situation where you're trying to identify what's causing that outbreak as soon as possible. But outside of those scenarios, they're really asking you to look at those clinical risk factors, those exposures, those patient symptoms to determine what are the most appropriate targets to test. And in a lot of cases, it's the bacterial targets, or maybe some of the more common non-bacterial targets like norovirus, Giardia, or Cryptosporidium. So that's kind of what our Veregene EP panel was focused on, right? We had a 9-target EP panel that was 7 bacterial targets, and then it had norovirus and rotavirus. And that was really focused in on this community-acquired diarrhea space, or this acute diarrhea space. But then you still had that need for immunocompromised patients where maybe you want a big full panel, or if it's persistent diarrhea, or maybe the patient has a travel history to resource-constrained areas where parasites might be more appropriate for testing. There's still need for that O&P or parasite testing option. And this slide doesn't even get into C. diff, right? C. diff itself has its own clinical guidelines for when you should or should not run a molecular test for C. diff. Because there are a portion of the population that are just natural carriers of C. diff. So if you were to just test every single GI sample with a molecular C. diff test, you run that risk of false positives. So this really helps you navigate these different clinical guidelines that are out there and adapt your test to that specific patient and what that patient needs. But that's just our perspective on it. Obviously, I'm biased. I'm with Diasorin. I'm in marketing. What's more important is the clinician perspective on this. So as promised, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Pride so he can share his experience with this type of testing.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today to talk to you guys about our experience at UCSD with some of this molecular testing. And I think it's sort of good to take you guys through, what we've been doing, really, I think for the last sort of 10 years with our molecular testing, having switched from a primarily stool culture based laboratory. I want to start off by sort of mentioning disclosures that I have, consulted for Roche and Hologica within the past couple of years. I don't know that any of that is relevant to this talk today, but I want to at least put that out there. So taking you guys back to what we have done at UC San Diego, we really started out, as most laboratories have, as primarily a stool culture based laboratory. And we were really early adopters of nucleic acid testing for GI cultures, and or at least for GI pathogens. And that started really a little bit over 10 years ago now. And there's a number of reasons that we decided to do that. I've been at UCSD for 15 years, and I'll admit that one of the big reasons that or big things that I wanted to accomplish when I came at UCSD was to switch the GI culture testing at UCSD. It's a little odd to look back and to kind of believe that it took 5 years to do that, but indeed it did take a long time. But part of that is that culture was just so ingrained in all of the things that we did. And as well as when we look back, one of the things that was just so clear is how many GI cultures we were doing and how many stool, ova, and parasites that we were doing as well. One of the things that I will just mention is that one of the things about our microbiology laboratories that maybe separate us from other places is that we really are a laboratory that likes to let clinicians make their decisions and kind of step out of the way, so that if clinicians want to run test X, we don't like to be so heavy-handed in saying you cannot have test X. So they were running a lot of stool cultures. They were running a lot of stool O&Ps, and we never really stopped that. When we were looking back at testing volumes, we were looking back at 20 years of testing volumes, and they were running 10 stool cultures a day for 20 plus years. And with almost every stool culture, they were getting 3 stool O and Ps. And that's pretty much every day. So you can imagine the number of stool O and Ps that we were doing in our laboratory was kind of astronomical. So it's something that we really needed to move on from. So it's kind of one of the main things that I really just wanted to get rid of at UCSD. Maybe even more so than the stool cultures, was to get rid of all of those stool O and Ps. And one of the things that really kind of caught me by surprise looking at what we were doing at UCSD is that we weren't doing any stool viral testing. And it's one of those things that where when you talk to clinicians, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking to an infectious disease doctor, a gastrointestinal doctor, even just a medical student, you can ask any of them, what's the main cause of diarrhea from patients that come to the emergency room? And they will all tell you the same thing, viruses. But then you look at what we test for, we do not test for viruses. We're doing 10 stool cultures a day, every day for 20 plus years. And when you see how many viruses we were testing for, we were sending out to other labs 10 stool virus tests per year. I mean, and that I'm not making those numbers up. We weren't testing for viruses at all. So it really was something that kind of needed to change in our culture. You could argue that, well, you got a stool virus, what are you going to do about it? But in terms of testing, our priorities were, quite frankly, a bit odd. I've talked a bit about why we made the switch, but as I look back on it, there were 4 sort of main reasons why we decided to make the switch, some of which were more important than others. The one we sort of have already talked about is we were just doing way too many stool O&Ps, and we'll kind of get back to that a little bit. The sensitivity of stool cultures, not all that great. We'll get back to that as well. But the point that I was kind of making is that physicians had just given up on stool viruses at our institution. It's just not something that we had ever tested for on any type of a reasonable basis. And to some extent, it's not great for patients. And I can tell you, as an infectious diseases doctor myself, there's a lot of patients where you'll say, hey, you've probably got a viral illness, keep yourself hydrated, you'll be fine in a few days, this will go away. And they're very happy to hear you say that. There are many other patients where you will tell them that and they will get mad. And they will say, well, aren't you going to give me antibiotics? And they'll just go find another doctor who will. If you can actually give them a result, sometimes that can solve problems. Testing for stool viruses can have its role. The fact that we had completely given up on the idea of testing for stool viruses, I don't think was a good thing. Probably the main reason for us, though, is antibiotic use. And as an infectious diseases doctor, the thing that drove me the craziest is that we were giving out way too many Cipro prescriptions in a hospital. And part of that is the practice of defensive medicine. And you can go, as I had mentioned, you can go to doctors in the ER, you can go to doctors in a hospital, you can ask them, what is the main cause of diarrhea in this hospital? They will all tell you it's viruses. But then you look at how those patients are treated, and you will see that most of them are getting Cipro prescriptions. And Cipro is not going to do anything for those viral infections. And you wonder, why are they doing that? And the reason that they're doing that is the practice of defensive medicine, because they don't want to be the one where this particular patient has something that ends up being a bacterial infection that doesn't go away on its own, and they get sued. So we were a bit of a Cipro factory, and you just see it over and over and over again when you went through the charts that, somewhere around 60, 70% of the patients who would come to our EDs were getting Cipro. So when we made the change, we partnered with pharmacy to make certain that we got rid of the Cipro culture at our institution because it was, quite frankly, something that was intolerable. So getting back to those other reasons that I had mentioned sort of before, we were running way too many stool O&Ps. We were running way too many stool cultures. The sensitivities of those tests are just not good. And most physicians don't know that. And it's one of those things, it's not like physicians are smart people. I mean, heck, I'm a physician. I'm not gonna go tell you that physicians are not smart people, but it's just not something that in a medical school class, people just go and tell you, right? We don't have a class on, stool culture sensitivity rates, unfortunately. So, if you had asked me when I was an ID fellow, what is the sensitivity rate of a stool culture? I don't know what I would have said. My guess is I probably would have said 15%. I don't actually know what I would have said. But I ask ID fellows and CLS students, what's the sensitivity rate of stool cultures? And the numbers that I get are shocking. I literally have had people tell me 80, 90% positivity rates. And I don't make fun of them or anything, but those numbers are just not in line with the reality, basically, because those positivity rates are way less than you could flip a coin, basically, and get. So we needed to make a switch to a test that could provide reliable sorts of results. So nucleic acid testing is basically the way to go. I don't know if there are places around here in San Diego or Southern California that are still relying primarily on stool cultures, but if you can get out of the stool culture business primarily, that's what you should do. Being able to test for some of these targets, we moved to the biofire film array test because that's what came on the market. We were early adopters. There's good things and bad things about being early adopters, but we could finally test for viruses. That was great for our patient population. We had a lot of norovirus. We didn't even really know what astrovirus and sapovirus were, but apparently we had a lot of that in our patient population at the time. We could find, rotavirus and adenovirus. All of these bacteria, we actually could culture most of them with the exception of C. diff, which was a problem in and of itself. We could actually culture most of them. But it was nice to be able to have some really reliable diagnostics on them from a nucleic acid amplification sort of step. Some of these bacteria, like aggregative E. coli, enteropathogenic E. coli, these are things we'd never tested for. We never wanted to test for. Quite frankly, still don't want to test for. Like I said, there's kind of some good and bads of some of these tests out there. And then these parasites, which testing for some of these parasites is not comprehensive the way a quote unquote stool O&P would be, but the sorts of results you can get for the targets that you're looking for certainly can be superior to doing stool O&Ps. The stool culture positivity rates at our institution year over year over year were between 3.9% and 4.2%. My 15% would have been way too high. The 80% that some of the people tell me would have been way too high. And it's just, like I said, physicians who ordered these tests just have no idea that the likelihood that they're going to get positives is not that great. But even with that said, going live with the nucleic acid amplification test and trying to get rid of cultures was not easy because we had to go to physicians and we had to say, hey, we want to get rid of stool cultures. And the physician said to us, no, you're not going to do that because we want to continue ordering stool cultures. So we battled back and forth with them, and we finally came up with the middle ground. And that middle ground was, we will continue to allow you to order stool cultures. We will make this test available. And in essence, may the best man or woman win. So that's exactly what we did. And we had some real, sort of tough guys out there who were just like, I will never order this test. I will use stool cultures for the rest of my life because this is a superior test. And those were the first people who ended up switching to these tests. And the reason for it is, the second that you get a test that is faster and provides you with results that you can act on, you start to realize, oh, I was probably wrong. And the one thing that physicians don't know is that we can track you in our LIS system, so we know what you're doing. Within weeks, we went from doing 10 stool cultures a day to doing 12 of these PCR tests or nucleic acid amplification tests, down to about 1 stool culture a day. And it was really, really fast at our institution. We went from a positivity rate of about 4.2% to what was actually about 36%. That includes the C. diff, and we won't really go through the C. diff, but finally we were able to get C. diff off of that assay. So, the assay in itself is not a perfect assay, but there are plenty of things that we can diagnose reliably using these nucleic acid amplification tests in our patient populations that we're just ecstatic about, basically. And these numbers, year over year, just rock solid for us, basically. Meaning, as I had sort of said, we didn't know sapovirus was in our population. We didn't know astrovirus was in our population. We didn't know what our norovirus positivity percentage was at all. We suspected it was probably our top positive, but it was nice to kind of get some confirmation on that. The one thing that I will say is that there had always been this debate about, hey, what is the most common pathogen in your patient population? Bacterial pathogen. Is it Campylobacter? Is it Salmonella? And most people were always on the Salmonella bandwagon. I was one of the few people that was on the Campylobacter bandwagon. I was, quite frankly, shocked that I was right on that one. I just didn't, because so many people thought that Salmonella was so much more common than Campylobacter. But it turns out the Campylobacter is more common in our patient population than it's Campylobacter. The one thing I don't think we predicted was that, well, Shigella was more common than both of them. But having these rates and knowing these rates really has just been extraordinarily helpful at our institution, and being able to track them over time has been extraordinarily helpful as well. Of course, this has not been without problems. The enteropathogenic E. coli, the C. diff, which, as I said, we've been able to deal with now, and the enteroaggregative E. coli is just, we don't know what to do with them. And it's just kind of a problem because they're not organisms we ever wanted to be testing for. They're organisms that we report with these big disclaimers that we say, hey, these can be colonizers, and physicians don't really know what to do with that language. Honestly, I would just like to write in the LIS, don't treat this. But I mean, then unfortunately, if it ever wasn't a colonizer, then they get to come sue me. So, we don't really know what to do with it, but a lot of physicians do treat these. And on top of that, then they try to do test to cure, and the test to cure do not work with these. So it's a problem. The other thing, though, that has happened is that we had noticed starting late 2022, we are seeing rate creeps in these assays, in particular the norovirus. And I think everyone kind of knows about this one particular issue with false positive noroviruses on this particular assay. And thus far, we don't have a great solution. Some institutions are sending those noroviruses out for confirmation via another assay. Some institutions are just repeating the norovirus over on the exact same assay. The problem is that a lot of this is at their own cost. And in the current financial environment where most people don't have a whole lot of money to be doing a whole lot of additional testing at their own cost, this is a big problem. And it's a big problem for us at our institution, and I would be surprised if it's not a problem for anybody in here that's doing testing on this exact same platform as well. So we don't really have great answers for that. And it's something that we are searching for answers for. So our positivity rate is definitely higher on this test than it used to be. It's not actually 47% because we got a lot of dual positives. It's closer to 35%, but that's much higher than the 21% that I showed you guys before. I just find the whole thing weird. It's just these are the same patients, and just over time, we're seeing such a substantial rate creep with some of these assays. In particular, our astrovirus is over twice what it used to be. Our sapovirus is also over twice what it used to be. All of these things just are a little bit concerning to us. So we're paying close attention to what we're seeing on a particular assay. We do have other problems. As I said, we think maybe 1 in 5, 1 in 6 of our noroviruses are false positives. Right now, we don't have a lasting solution, which is why we're searching for other solutions. The enteropathogenic and the enteroaggregative E. coli, we just, when we report things, we want to know that the answers in themselves are reliable. The one thing that physicians hate is, well, I don't know if it's real. They do not want to hear that from lab directors. I can assure you guys. When we report something, that's the last thing we want to say. We don't want to report something with a disclaimer, so that as we look towards other tests in the future, these are not things that we want to be reporting. As we start to think about what is our next test in the future, those are things that we don't want to have to report. We are thinking really, really strongly about our next steps. And in the kind of current environment that we're in, we're thinking about issues that we have to address. And one of the more obvious things that we kind of have gone over today is the need to adjust to reimbursement structures. That's kind of really important, whether you're testing for 5 targets, whether you're testing for 11 targets, whether it's the 7 that was kind of gone over earlier today. We want to make certain that whatever we're testing for, our institution can be reimbursed for. We want to reduce the overtesting at our institution. Before it was overtesting with 10 stool cultures a day and 30 stool O&Ps a day. Unfortunately, what we now have is something that we created and did not intend to create. It's overtesting of of our GI nucleic acid amplification test, and sadly, I'm the cause of that. We are, in the process of trying to implement restrictions that are probably going to follow some of these new models to ensure that our institution can be reimbursed for what we do as well, because we're feeling all of these sort of downward pressures to do things like reduce our costs, and we do want to get rid of the sort of one-size-fits-all syndromic testing models, except for maybe the sickest of our sick immunocompromised patients, because it's just too much. And I didn't even mention one thing that for us, as I sort of mentioned, there are goods and there are bads of being early adopters. The one really bad thing that we learned about being early adopters that we had never intended was that when we brought that test online with C. diff, we never imagined people would start using that test as their default C. diff assay. It's just people just like, oh, why the heck am I just going to test for C. diff? I'll just run this 23-member panel. And we tried to stop it, and nobody would listen to us. So we had to find a way to implement restrictions, because that test is a horrible C. diff test. But sometimes you learn the hard way. What physician behaviors might be in certain circumstances. So we are going to add flexibility. That's why we are interested in this test from Diasorin that used to be this test from Luminex that we were actually really interested in back at the time. And that's just the idea of being able to choose the targets that you want. The one thing that we would probably do a little different is that we're probably not going to let the physicians choose the targets that they want. We probably would choose the targets for them, because at our institution, it would be a free-for-all if we let the physicians choose. And it's probably because our lab is run by infectious diseases physicians, so maybe we just think we know. I don't know. But we would probably choose for them what would be on these different panels for clinically relevant syndromes, rather than letting them choose in each case. And I think they probably would appreciate it, because, quite frankly, if we put a 19-member panel or a 23-member panel in front of them, they're probably going to choose all of them anyway and say, hey, you just figure it out. We think that it's important for them to have choices, but probably more limited choices rather than the one size fits all. We have to have results that are easy to interpret. So no more of this sort of C. diff testing, particularly for people that are unlikely to have C. diff. We learned that lesson the hard way. We don't want to be testing for probable or likely colonizers anymore. So having the ability to just not choose enteroaggregative or enteropathogenic E. coli, I mean, for us, that's quite frankly gold, and it's something that we don't have right now. So we absolutely need panels that allow us that sort of choice. And for example, we want to provide results that we think are comprehensive. And, for our most immunocompromised patients, for example, we want to be able to provide them with comprehensive results. Even if we can't be reimburse for the entire thing, we probably will do it for those select patient populations. So we probably have a bacterial panel. We'll probably have a viral panel. We'll probably have something that has bacteria and viruses in it. We probably would even have a parasite panel at our institution. It would probably be panels, like I said, of our choosing. But I recognize that at some institutions, they would probably let the physicians choose what are on their particular panels, which is probably perfectly fine depending on your own institutions and the sort of trust that you have in your physicians to do those sorts of things. And we want to be able to approach different diarrheal syndromes in the most appropriate sort of fashions. So what we would probably offer is something very specifically for hospital-acquired diarrhea, something for community-acquired diarrhea, something for the immunocompromised, and even a traveler's sort of diarrheal type panel. And we think that will work really, really well for our patients. The one thing I probably didn't mention is that, in particular, in our hospital system, and maybe in every hospital system, I don't know, when we put together a bunch of choices like these, or like I mentioned the last time, bacterial panel, parasite panel, viral panel, usually what physicians at our institution do, they just click every box and say, you figure it out. So what we tend to do is we tend to just have an algorithm. If you check every box, this is what we do. And we make it completely black and white. We advertise it. This is what we do if you check every box. So there's, in essence, no gray area. People know what happens if they check every box. So that's probably what we would do in the sort of situation of having a test like this where there's a ton of flexibility. Okay, so I think I've probably gone through this. We at our institution, we do implement rules to limit the use of these panels. This has been a long time coming, but we do get a lot of requests for exceptions. And I would say probably the biggest request that we get is, hey, the patient came into the emergency room 3 days ago. We tested for, this respiratory panel or this GI panel. Now they're back today. We want to test for the exact same thing. And that's against our rules because, we can track 3 days whether you were admitted or not. And the one thing we like to say is, think a little harder, these, come on. It's the same. The patient's coming back with the same symptoms, So we do have these rules to try to limit, just gross overtesting of these things because if we can pick up salmonella 3 days ago, we can still pick it up today. It's not going to change. Make certain you have those sorts of rules in your LIS system to prevent those sorts of abuses because you may not be able to be reimbursed for those sorts of things. Okay, I think that's all I have.